every belief is limited. There's no belief that's not limited. It's informed by a set of experiences. Maybe it was formed by a particular tradition from a particular place and time, but all beliefs are limited. The challenge is, can we recognize when we are so convinced by our beliefs that we close ourselves off to the experiences right under our noses?
Hello, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you're going to hear from people in a wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. But we're changing that here at the Goodness Exchange, the mothership website of this podcast, where you can find thousands of articles about what's right with the world. Okay, today we have an amazing guest, Ayo Yetunde. Ayo is an expert in the world's greatest wisdom traditions, philosophies, and religions. And then she brings all that wisdom together to help us use fresh eyes to see the common struggles and challenges in our life. In this interview, we just go from one topic to another, and we talk about things like, how are we supposed to feel inside when we have to step over a homeless person? And how do we get through awkward conversations with a loved one that we really need to have? Or how do we cope with the negative news? In this conversation, Ayo gives us a fresh, graceful way to deal with challenges large and small every day, and I can't thank her enough for sharing this with us. Ayo has a great new book called Casting Indra's Net, which is also a wonderful way of pulling all the negative pieces together and then looking at them with fresh eyes based on the wisdom that is timeless throughout history. So welcome, Ayo Yetunde. Thank you so much for joining us here. You know, I was introduced to Ayo's work through another thought leader, which we'll put in the show notes. There's a wonderful person that we interviewed a few months ago named Flint Sparks, who is 40 years a trained psychologist and a Zen teacher. And one day when he and I were just talking as friends, he said, "Oh, I have the most amazing person you have to interview on the podcast." So that's how I came to know you, Ayo. Thank you for answering that. Oh yeah, Flint is an interesting, wonderful soul in the world. And, one of the things he and I were talking about when he introduced you to me, he and I were having a great conversation about this notion of interdependence. It's a word that I think keeps popping up lately. I think it may be one of the good things to come out of all the chaos that we've been through in the last 4 years. Ayo, your work is so involved in the timeless wisdom that we all could have access to that I'm sure you have something lovely to start us off on about interdependence.
Well, Linda, I think you're right. The word does keep popping up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons why the word keeps popping up is because we are coming to grips with the profound loneliness in our society today. We're coming to grips to it. We are admitting to it. There's nothing to be ashamed about it. It's a reality. And we would like to reconnect with people. We would like to also understand where we belong in the cosmos, if you will.
Yes.
What is my purpose? What is my place? What does all of this mean now? And so the word interdependence is a way of helping us understand that even in the chaos, we are still related to one another. We still need one another. People and other living beings need us. And when we really reflect on this multi-leveled need that we have for each other, we can also come forth with an understanding of what our responsibilities are to ourselves and to each other, recognizing the reality of interdependence.
We talk about this on a micro level and on a macro level. Like interdependence, like we've got to figure out how to get along in our families.
Right. And we do know. We know.
Yeah. Okay, tell me. Yeah, I don't feel like we know.
Sometimes we're stubborn.
Okay.
Sometimes we get caught into a position and we don't know how to get out of it. Sometimes we're so wounded that we do need to take space from harmful situations in order to heal. So the question about how do we get along with people in our family, and how and who is our family, to whom do we belong, and so on. There are many lessons about how to do that from many traditions throughout the ages, and respect is one of those lessons. What does it mean to be respectful of oneself and respectful of others? And one of the things I think we know is a manifestation of what respect looks like is when our bodies are recognized, that they are with boundaries, that we are not to be touched unless we've been given permission to be touched, that even in our environment, we want to be free of pollutants so that we can breathe, respecting our organs so that people and systems, living systems, can thrive to the greatest extent. That's what it means to be respectful. So back to the old lessons, wisdom. It's understood in many traditions that we respect those who gave us life. And that means we respect our parents. It doesn't mean that we agree with our parents. It doesn't mean that we always do what they ask us to do. It doesn't mean that we become little mini-me's for the rest of our lives. But we honor the fact that we didn't give birth to them. They gave birth to us. And therefore, that there might be some things that they know, right, that we don't know. And we just respect that. And we respect that in other people as well.
Yeah, also, I think one of the respect hitches that I see in society that just is in your face so much in our negative media landscape is how respect relates to dignity, like preserving the dignity of others. Like, I cannot watch reality shows because it's all about how we take away other people's dignity. The news even affects me like that. Like, you take away my dignity if all you do is tell me about the danger and disorder and you don't tell me about the helpers. Talk to me about dignity and preserving others' dignity.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I'd like to begin with the dignity that we need to recognize in ourselves. If we don't recognize it in ourselves, it's not likely we're going to recognize it in others. And it's not likely we're going to take the actions we might need to take to protect our own dignity and the dignity of others. To have a stage, television, for example, where people are dehumanized, and that dehumanization is part of our ways of being entertained and ways to attract advertising dollars so that the dehumanization can be replicated over and over again. And then blur the lines between so-called art and reality. Yes, if we consume undignified material over and over again, then it's very likely in reality we will act in undignified ways. And that hurts. And no one wants to feel that kind of pain.
No. And we know when it goes the other way, we know each of us so much, so well, that teacher that preserved our dignity in a funny moment and then made us feel elevated. We know the aunt who always made us feel like we were important and that we were heard and all that. The opposite usually forms some pretty powerful memories in all of us when somebody protected our dignity or they just gave us reason to walk a little taller.
Right.
And
we can do that for each other.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So easily we can do that for each other.
It's not a stretch. It's not hard work either. If you notice somebody's really skilled at something, tell them. If somebody makes you always feel like anything's possible, tell them. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So another topic that I really wanted us to talk about, because it's related to this and dignity, is I've heard you talk about how we bring compassion into our everyday lives.
Mm.
So the example I'd like to give is that, that we all think we maybe should donate more to charities, or we should volunteer more, all that. But I think that everyday life calls us to find where we're working on our compassion quotient when we come across a homeless person. Now, there's not one of us that doesn't have to work around or step over a homeless person and hurt somewhere in our heart, our shared humanity. Talk to us about finding compassion in everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm going to begin again. As a pastoral counselor, I guess I always start with the person. We thrive when we can be compassionate towards ourselves.
Okay.
Not exclusively towards ourselves, but to ourselves. We have lived lives where we have struggled, where we have made mistakes, where we have received countless slights, where we have been rejected, where we've had unmet expectations. And these things begin to wear us down and wear on us. And so to be able to say, I am none of those things define me. Maybe at some point I thought they did define me, and I acted out of those hurts. I acted out of those wounds and those unmet expectations. But through mindfulness, I think mindfulness is a very powerful practice. Mm-hmm. We can see, oh, these are things that I experienced, but they don't define me. Mm-hmm. And even in the acceptance of not being defined by those things, that in itself is an act of self-compassion. Okay. And when we have experienced self-compassion in that way, I think it kind of brightens our eyes so that we can see when other people are deluded, if you will, by their self-concepts wrapped around past wounds. For example, oh, I can't do that because of something that happened in the past. Or I am unworthy of receiving that kind of grace because of the mistake that I made 30 years ago. And for then us as friends, I will say as friends, yes, unconditional love, loving friends can say, you know what? I see how you're limiting yourself. I see that you've put a roadblock in your path. And I'm curious about that. What leads you to believe that you're not able to do that? And then really be attentive to the narrative that's coming forth. And then say, you know what? I heard you. I understand it. That was painful. It got in the way of you doing the things you want to do. And I want to let you say, I've been free of that narrative. I never knew about that narrative until now. Here's what I see in you. And take that step, and I will be there with you when you get there to celebrate that you took that step.
I love this, this notion of telling others what we see in them. This is, quintessential in my life as a healthcare provider. My husband and I are both dentists, mm-hmm. and we built a practice around finding something to celebrate with every single patient. Anything, large and small. But, that was part of it, is just knowing that part of my job to get through a hard thing, like we all have to have at the dentist, it's hard. Mm-hmm. To get through that, it was so much kinder to find some place where I made sure that they knew what they brought out in me, that they were welcome in this space with me. And how about the kind of people who just go ahead and say, that's what I love about you. I mean, we always love to be around people that point out our inner beauty, right?
Yes.
And maybe the head talk, maybe it's us. It's our mental chatter that's driving us down.
It does often, especially if it's negative.
Yeah.
Right. But sometimes we create a habit of negative talk to protect us.
Okay.
Right. From experiencing additional traumas and additional hurts. Right. So it's, for some people, it's also acting as a buffer against pain, or a way of convincing us that we're just safer if we stay put. And that's an act of love, but it also is not always an act of truth.
Yeah, that resistance to change if we just stay put. Okay, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk to Ayo and get all kinds of little wonders. I would call them wonders of insight that we might be able to remember tonight at the dinner table with our kids, or tomorrow when somebody cuts us off in traffic, or the day after when a coworker is making us really crazy. I really love your work, Ayo, in what I've already learned this far after doing a deep dive in your digital footprint, is that you give me so many fresh insights that I can use to make sense of the world. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Ayo more about these sort of graceful wonders. You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time, or maybe even the emotional stamina, to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Our subscription model is a pay-what-you-can model, so that everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics and no ads for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different, because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back, and we are going to get right on the subject of something you mentioned a second ago. Let's talk about grace. You know, you don't hear people use that word very often these days, but I think the world's great wisdom traditions have something to say about grace, all in their own way.
Yes.
That reminds us about how we respond to the homeless person, or being cut off in traffic, or our mother-in-law doing some crazy thing, or our 14-year-old not coming in for curfew. All the realities of everyday living where there's friction, there's a place to apply grace.
Always.
And then there's just a way of being in the world. So talk to us about grace, Ayo.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. You know, a lot of words that we use from old traditions, wisdom traditions, are laden. And sometimes it scares people because, you know, you think, oh, we're going to get into a religious debate or anything like that. Not at all. For me, the word grace is about not harming. It's about taking a position of not harming, regardless of whether a person says something you like or don't like, or don't do. It's about mercy, right? It's about recognizing our own and another's vulnerability and not exacerbating it. It's about refraining from the pursuit of unnecessary arguments, right? In our wisdom, we can know sometimes this conversation is not going anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
I may have all this knowledge, what have you, but I can see that this person is not open to receiving it. Therefore, in an act of grace, I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it go and return to the things that I know unify us. And so I love the word grace, and it's a word that I use in my centering prayer practice every day to remind myself that all of us have come from different paths, things that we can never know about another person. That's real.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's real, and because no one can ever know anything about me, everything about me, there needs to be a place always in our discourse with one another for grace.
I have a little practice that I do at bedtime because I just feel like I have like this deep kind of empathy for the world. I would just walk around way more depressed than I do because I feel like I have some agency over something in the fact that I can react more gracefully to a given moment or
Mm-hmm.
not. I mean, I can't choose what's the incoming is, but I can choose what's outgoing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So at night, I think about the things I went through in a given day. I'll give you, for instance, I'm doing growth conferences at our dental practice. So we have 13 employees, and I'm sitting down for an hour, hour and a half with every one of them. And one of them kind of put me on the spot the other day. And so what I do is at night, I think about all of the moments I did summon some grace. When I got passed by a teenager going 99 miles an hour, and I felt like if he hadn't served at just the right moment, I would have had a head-on collision with someone. Like in that moment, I didn't act very graceful. Or in the growth conference, I got challenged by this thing, and I didn't act very graceful. And so at night, I could give you 15 examples of times I did get through the day and act graceful.
Mm-hmm.
I try and do just a little thinking back so that next time when I get that confrontation, I might be able to pause for just 2 seconds and find more grace. So while you have a prayer, I have a practice.
Mm-hmm.
What else can you suggest for us to find more grace in moments?
Mm-hmm. Well, you and I live in a country right now that is not torn apart, torn asunder by war.
Mm.
Okay. There are places in this world where they don't know where their water's coming from, where their food's coming from. They have no concept of a possibility of their children going to school. There are countless pieces of evidence for grace in our world, from relatively clean air and drinkable water, to neighbors who are not turning on us, to grocery stores that have food on shelves. And there are also places that have just gone through ecological devastation, right? And these are reminders that the things that we have access to are not guaranteed. And when we think about that we don't control everything, right? We can say, in this moment or throughout the day, I had many moments of grace that I'm grateful for, and I will pay it forward tomorrow.
That is the way to think about it. I've been very me focused, I must admit now that I hear you say it that way. I've been, oh, did I do it right? Did I not do it right? Did I do it right? Did I not do it right? But wow, to think about how my life is blessed, graced with all this opportunity and all this goodness. That's something to be so celebratory about it.
Mm-hmm. We forget.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, we forget.
We
Yeah.
forget. Yeah, that's great. And that leads us to this topic of resilience, because we do all, we don't have active war in our country, but we do have active strife.
Yes.
And we do have a lot of things that can just make us go, how are we ever going to get through this? So, how do we be resilient in the face of the negative noise or real things that are happening in our lives? Our mother dies or our whatever. Where talk to us about resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're not robots. All right, I'll start there. Okay. We're not robots, so we can't just replace a battery here and there in order to feel energized again and able to bounce back after a defeat. Yeah. But I think it's really important in these days for us to know what we value and who we value. Is love a value? Is compassion, empathy? Are these the things, connection, interdependence? Do we value these things? And if we do, are we willing to protect them in our lives? Protect them and cultivate them? And if we are, then we need to remove ourselves from the things that undermine love and compassion and our ability to cultivate them. If we're not willing to do that, then we don't really value those things. So I think that would be a first step to determine what we value. And then maybe determine what depletes us, what depletes our energy. Like, do I feel horrible after I've watched the news? Then maybe I should watch the news less. Yeah. Or maybe get my news from a different source, right? Still factually based, but not one where I'm getting hyped up and feeling horrible at the end of the day. And then decide if this is something that depletes my energy, depletes my hopefulness, depletes my trust in others, then I need to put it aside. Yeah. Maybe I was entertained. And if I was entertained by these things, what was I avoiding? Yeah. What was I avoiding? And can I face that? Now that I've put those things away, what do I need to face? And does it scare me? Yeah. And if it does, is that fear kind of like a thin line of fear that is throughout my entire life? And if so, do I want to keep living like that? Or is it time now for me to face that thing that scares me so that it no longer has power over me? That kind of depleting power that makes it difficult for me to live a resilient life.
Give me an example. Do you have a good story?
Well, what comes to my mind is just that I think many of us can relate to the reality that many of us have unresolved issues, be it with a parent, the child, with a loved one. Usually it's a loved one. Mm-hmm. If that person is still alive, and it's like, it's just, I don't know, then we need to make a choice. If we value resilience, like, I want to live in this life with more energy rather than less, feeling empowered rather than weak, feeling capable and confident rather than insecure, right? Yeah. Yet I still have this thing, this person, this issue that I still like just drags me down. It might be time to approach a resolution. Right. And a simple a note, an email, a text can be the beginning of releasing the power that unresolved issue has had over us, so that we can let it go. And then in the letting go, we can begin to experience more freedom. Mm-hmm. And as I think feeling free is energizing, it's restorative, and restoration is what leads to feeling resilient.
Am I right in thinking, let's say it's an awkward conversation that you're avoiding with somebody that's important in your life or that you have to interact with a lot? I'm thinking of a conversation I need to have with my brother. We laughed about that in our pre-call. And what happens is if I get there in my head, like, okay, I'm going to inspire a conversation. Then I'm all fear. Then I just go to fear. I kind of play how the conversation will probably start and go and then end. And I'm afraid to go there. Mm-hmm. And I need courage. I think part of resilience is courage. And talk to us about courage. And,
Yeah. I think one of the things that helps us feel encouraged is having some good skills.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, when it comes to communication, I really love the teachings that come out of Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg.
Okay.
So we know that one of the things that derails a conversation is when people feel judged.
Okay.
Right? Because then you have to deal not only with the content of the conversation, but you have to deal with the feelings of being judged and the defensiveness that arises from feeling judged. And then that takes the conversation way off track. So learning to communicate without judging others is
Yeah.
key. Right? So in nonviolent communication, a few of the lessons that come from that include when you have an issue that you would like to raise with someone, just communicate the facts.
Okay.
Don't blame the person, right? Don't blame them, just the facts.
Yeah.
Then after you state the facts, and not necessarily in this order, but after you state the facts, you will eventually get to a request, right?
Yeah.
But before you get to the request, you own your own feelings. You don't try to say what another person felt, what they meant, right?
Yes.
That's the judgment stuff, right? Oh, I know what you meant when you said blah, blah, blah. No, it's like, okay, these are the facts. This is how I felt. Okay. I would like to request that you not do that again. But before making that request, do it with no expectation that the person is going to honor your request. That readies you for disappointment and also protects them from you going off the handle if they don't say, okay, whatever you want.
That's right. Yeah.
I get it now. Thank you.
Yes.
Right?
I've been half jokingly saying for years that that the key to happiness is low expectations.
I think there's truth in that.
It applies in restaurants for sure. Low expectations.
So funny.
But probably when dealing with these kind of hard issues too.
Yeah. But courage, I think, is cultivated when we practice skills.
Yeah.
And we practice them with different people. They become just natural. And then what do we fear? Right? Yeah. What is there to fear? That we're not heard? That we didn't get what we wanted? Those are always possibilities. But the worst is I didn't live a life of integrity. That's the worst.
Okay. Yeah. So that means that means not bringing it up at all and just walking around with the burden kind of does leave you not living with integrity. If you're willing to accept all kinds of burdens and not just try to communicate with people, do you think that hurts our sense of integrity?
Well, sometimes it's really, there's so much more to it. Is this person really open to engaging? If they're not open to engaging, then don't engage, right?
Okay. So that's the first part.
Right?
Right. Yes.
If they're not open. But you won't know if they're open unless you try.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Is this person incapable, truly incapable of receiving me as a human being? If they are truly incapable, well, are they always incapable? Like 24/7? There's never a moment when they are relaxed enough to see you as a human being with needs? Then if you're not dealing with a sociopath, it might be a question about timing, right? Yes, the timing. Is there something that I need to broach and repent for or apologize for before I enter into this grievance that I have?
Right there.
I might need to ask that question.
Yes. That is so true. I mean, like the whole world seems to want everybody else to apologize and nobody wants to be wrong. I mean, and I think there's so much freedom in admitting that you were wrong or just saying, my favorite line is, I don't know what I was thinking.
I like that. I'm going to use that more often.
Yeah, it's so much easier than boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I wrong just invites others to just step on you. Yeah, you sure were. Right. But when you say, gosh, I just don't know what I was thinking. I'm so sorry.
Right. There's that. And also then grow into that so that we can accept when we were wrong and not be defined by that. Because the converse is we're right about everything. Yeah. And we know that that's not true.
Exactly.
That's not even possible.
It's not even possible. That we've got to remember that it's not even possible. In fact, I've learned so much that I'm a sort of a Mrs. Bossy Pants type. I'm very type A and very get stuff done and that kind of thing. And I've learned by having a team of 13 people in this dental practice that I had to keep feeling like I respected their dignity and keep feeling good about their professional lives and the lives of others and all that stuff. Being in that space has allowed me to really realize how much others can improve my way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So that has been freeing, is to realize that I don't got it. Most of the time, somebody can improve my way of thinking, and then I'm off like a rocket. S-
Thinking about interdependence, your way of thinking, you didn't come up with that by yourself,
no.
right?
Yes.
So even your own way of thinking
Right.
is created by a variety of sources, known and unknown, and will always be. Our ways of thinking are dependent upon one another. Right now, you and I are influencing each other's way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. And improving it, like every conversation I have, even if I'm going, to myself, I might be saying, just the other day, I was at a conference, a Vermont Leadership Summit, and I had just texted my daughter. She had COVID, so I went in her place, and I texted her at 10 o'clock in the morning. Oh, I don't know why I'm here. This probably isn't going to be a day where I connect. I see why you signed up, but I don't see why I'm here. And not even 10 minutes later, boom, I slipped and fell. It was raining outside, and I slipped and fell. And one of Vermont's most insightful leaders was the guy walking in behind me, picked me up, dusted me off, and so forth. And we had the most incredible conversation. And I'm going to interview him next week. And there I was, setting a limiting belief that this conference doesn't have anything for me. And then, boom, within 15 minutes, I stayed the whole day. I had the most extraordinary time. I met so many people, young and old, and who all improved my way of thinking on something. Talk to us about limiting beliefs, because I would imagine that the world's wisdom traditions have something to say about being flexible and growing and having a growth mindset.
Right. So, this is so juicy, Linda, because on one level, I want to say, and will say, every belief is limited.
Okay, everyone.
There's no belief that's not limited.
Okay.
Right? It's informed by a set of experiences. Maybe it was formed by a particular tradition from a particular place and time, but all beliefs are limited. The challenge is, can we recognize when we are so convinced by our beliefs that we close ourselves off to the experiences right under our noses, right? And that's what you were talking about.
Yes.
You needed to fall and be picked up in order to have a completely different perspective on where you were at that time.
I have to tell you who this gentleman is. He runs something that I think you'd find interesting. He came up with in the year 2000. He was a Vermont resident who found that he didn't know his neighbors well enough. And it really disturbed him that the internet was starting to grow and sort of having us have way more disconnected lives on the internet instead of knowing our neighbors. So he started this thing called Front Porch Forum. And Vermont, I think it's like, we only have like 500,000 people in the whole state. I think he has like 2/3 of Vermont is on this thing called Front Porch Forum. And it's built to connect us each with our neighbors.
That's beautiful.
And it's trading, it's recycling together, it's trading ideas or thoughts or knowledge about what's happening or whatever. And I think this sense of community kind of also relates to courage these days.
Yeah.
Right?
And to be encouraged to be in community.
Yes.
Is key. And I think there's probably a feedback loop there. The more you are in community, the more courage you feel, the more encouraged you feel, the more you want to be engaged in community. And neuroscientists are demonstrating now that the most important thing to help us stay connected and unified is when we do work together. When we work on a project together, that stuff about, well, what party you belong to, what religion you belong to, what race you identify, what gender you express, and so on. Look, we have a project. We got to get the work done. Let's do that.
That's another interview that I'll put all these interviews that she and I are referring to. I'll also I've been writing things down. If people have noticed me looking down with a pen, I've been keeping track of things. I'll make sure that Marshall Rosenberg book about nonviolent communication. I'll make sure that's in the show notes on the Goodness Exchange too. So anything that Ayo and I are mentioning, we'll make sure is in the show notes for folks. But back to where we were with courage and community. It reminds me of a question I don't think I've ever asked anyone, and I definitely want to know this from you. So I've been looking at where courage comes from and where this word community is starting to pop up a lot too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the women in our lives and how women have, through thousands of years, had to be in community because, like they say, men are built to protect the village and women are built to protect the community. I mean, their children. Like there's this thing that made women have to just like protect everybody, not just themselves. And in community, they relied on each other and so forth. There's a lot of history about communities of women. But I wonder about if women are where original courage comes from. Like I would guess with the path that your life has been on, do you have some woman in your background, a mother, grandmother, aunt, somebody where your original courage comes from?
Oh, wow. I love that question. You never asked anyone that
I have
question?
never asked anyone that
Wow,
question.
I love that question so much. I'm going to encourage you, Linda, to ask everybody that question.
I'm going to ask everyone. I have to tell you, my mom passed about 2 years ago, and she was she had a crazy life. Both her parents died by the time she was 10. She was an orphan living with she thinks a prostitute that her dad had taken up with after her mom died.
Mm-hmm.
And a little Lithuanian woman in the grocery store below their apartment said, "Honey, don't you have anyone in the world?" And she showed her what an envelope looked like. And she told her to go root through her apartment and find an envelope, find all the envelopes she could find. Because this little Lithuanian woman thought that there would probably be an envelope with the return address of an aunt or uncle on it somewhere in that apartment. And my mom did find an aunt or uncle's address, and this woman thankfully wrote. And my mom took a bus across the United States all by herself at age 10. And I've always said in our family that my dad was a decent guy too, but my mom is where my original courage comes from. She just had one thing after another happen to her in her life and turned out to live long and well. And, there were flaws and all the stuff that come with it, but that's who I owe my original courage to. So how about you?
Yeah.
Like, do you have somebody?
Well, I am fortunate in that I've had many wonderful women in my life.
Okay.
So I'm going to name two, actually.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about my mother, who taught me how to be a friend to others. I mean, truly, like my mother, I feel like is the queen in the art of friendship.
Oh my gosh.
When to think about others, how to express that you've been thinking about them, when to visit, what to bring when you visit, as well as being parts of service organizations, helping seniors before she was a senior. And then when she became a senior, helping older seniors. So I've learned the art of friendship. And I think this is really important to say. In the mid 1980s, in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I grew up, I had a summer job at the U.S. Army. My mother was an employee of the Army. She introduced me to one of her colleagues who was transitioning from male to female.
Way back then?
Yes. This is why I'm bringing it up.
Okay. This is serious.
My reaction was, that's the oddest thing I've ever heard of. And my mother said, this person deserves your respect regardless. So the courage to be friends to everyone, including those we think are weird, that came from my mother. From my grandmother, who was my aunt before she formally adopted my mother, I learned the courage to adopt. And so later in life, we adopted our child. The courage to love someone like that, to take them into your home and raise them as your child, was very impactful. So those are just two of many, many fabulous women in my life who I learned courage from.
Oh, Lovely. And I think I will take your advice. I do have to tell the story of how I got there. I was on a trip with, and I was sitting on the front of a bouncing boat looking for whales somewhere on a trip where you paddle a kayak all over the place in Mexico and look for whales. And I was talking to an executive from a big oil company who was also on the trip. And he and I'm not kidding, we spent an hour talking about the leaders in our lives and the people who most impacted our lives. And we never mentioned a woman through the whole entire conversation. And this is me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I grew up, I was born in 1960 when all a woman could be was a flight attendant, teacher, nurse, or I don't know. That's all you could be. Secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Right.
I have a kind of a bent. I was one of only 5 women in my dental school class. I can't believe I sat for an hour talking to this guy and never mentioned one powerful, strong, amazing woman in my life. And I tell you, then all of a sudden it hit me. I don't know. We hit a particularly bad bump and I went, holy moly. I bet you there's some amazing women in our lives too. And then we spent 2 hours talking about the women. And the stories that came from that guy were unbelievable. And I realized how important it is that we recognize our ancestors and their wisdom and their way of who we are comes from all these people who took risks and who were courageous and gentle and graceful. And I mean, God, think what women had to be. They had to be all of it all at the same time.
Many.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay. On that, as we kind of wrap up here, I was wondering about, because we're dabbling on the edges of it, a topic that comes up a lot these days is leadership. And I'm really thinking these days that leadership has a lot of definitions. And I think it's more what we give ourselves to, the leaders. Like just because somebody's the CEO in our company doesn't mean we respect them. But we might have a team member who is gracious and thoughtful and hardworking and always brings out the best in others. And we look at them for their leadership. When there's something happening, we'll look to them to see how they're reacting. There's this great quote by Mr. Rogers. He says his mother used to say, when something very, very bad is happening, I'm paraphrasing, when something very bad is happening, look for the helpers. So I'm looking at our world right now and wondering if there's a difference in the wisdom traditions between who we give our attention to. Do we give it to the people who've been bonked on the head as leaders, or should we be looking for the helpers? Or what does the wisdom tradition say about who we give our attention to?
Yeah. Along with all the other great questions that you have posed, Linda, this is another one. I would say this is one for the books. We always need to think about this because we are all vulnerable people. Yeah. All of us are vulnerable all the time, vulnerable to something. And it doesn't matter what position you have in a situation, whether you're the leader or not, you're still vulnerable. Yes. But the wisdom traditions point us towards those who are the most vulnerable. And one of the reasons why they point us to those who are the most vulnerable is because that's the opportunity, not only for, if you will, salvation. I know. I don't mean it in the religious.
I know. No,
I don't mean it in the religious sense. I mean it in the civilizing sense.
Oh, yeah.
That we've got the greatest chance of coexisting with each other if we are able to keep our attention on the causes and conditions of our vulnerability. And if we can keep our attention on the causes and conditions of our vulnerability, then we've got a greater chance to determine how to best meet the pain and suffering that arises in that vulnerability, how to live grace-filled lives like we talked about before, how to live a life of non-harming, and how to diminish the causes for that suffering and that pain so that we can coexist as neighbors, so we can be those front porch folk to each other because we are interdependent. Because we are interdependent and there's no escaping that, why not make the most of it by enjoying each other, relying on one another, not living in fear of isolation and alienation, because I know my neighbor is going to have my back when needed and I'm going to have theirs. when they need me.
Mm-hmm. I think we should have one more question and just sit on that, because that is really where it's at. We've got to find a way to live with our differences and still feel like we have each other's back and know that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, here in Vermont, we have very icy driving conditions a lot. Just crazy driving conditions sometimes. And, you know, when your car spins off the road, almost everybody has had this happen, and goes down to a ravine, and the next car sees that that's happened. The way they say to do it is you can pull over to help that person, but you should not get out of the car, because, and this makes total sense, there's some black ice back there, and you could be out of your car with good intention to go help that other person, and then the next car spins and takes you out.
Mm-hmm.
So the minute this happens, we are all forced to be sitting in this car, know that we might be helpful to that person who just spun out down the ravine, but then we know that we have this moment where we got to choose ourselves or others.
Mm-hmm.
And people get out of their cars and they go help the other down the ravine all the time. They don't just sit there. So there's something in us, and we don't look to see what color their skin is or ask their politics when we get down there. None of that happens in these moments when we are sharing what it is that makes us human.
Mm-hmm.
How do we stay in that mindset?
I think we need to work on ourselves. I know I keep coming back to the individual, but in order to stay in that mindset means that I need to take care of my mind. And no one can get into my mind but me. So that's my responsibility.
Yes.
It is to keep my mind and my heart connected. When I walk down the streets in Chicago, in my neighborhood, I make an effort to say hello to everyone who's passing by.
Okay.
And by everyone, I mean the babies and the dogs and the cats and the squirrels, so that I remember my interconnection, because it's so easy to forget. And I do forget, but I try to make an effort to remember. And that point of recognizing our connection ought not be dependent upon a crisis. I should be able to look at you, look at your baby and your dog, and say, ooh, look at y'all, and I do. I do that sometimes. Look at y'all, look at you all together. That's wonderful. Right. Have a good day. Right. I live on Hermitage. Where do you live? Right. You know, that kind of thing. And that's irrespective. I don't need to know your story. I don't need to know your politics. I don't need to know your religion. I don't need to know what school you attended, if any school. What I do know is that you're a human being, and I am too. And because of those things, I know something about your experience, your lived experience.
Oh. Ayo, that's absolutely a beautiful way to think. I'm going to work on it. You've planted some seeds that that are really going to take root in me. I hope likewise for everybody who listens to this interview. I want to wrap up with a question I ask everybody. You know, if this interview had only been like 3 minutes long, I'm sure there's something that if we just only had the 3 minutes, what do you really wish people knew? Sometimes when you look at the world and you look at the beauty in the world or the strife, whatever comes to mind, what do you really wish people knew?
The joy in giving.
That good for the receiver, good for the giver thing. It's all a big multiplier. It's 1 + 1 = 11.
And the more we see it, the more we want to do it.
Just last night, we were sitting around with my kids and my husband, and I don't go on TikTok. I don't go on Instagram and a lot of the services that have these quick videos. But they were all laughing about, and then the funny video conversations went into all the poignant ones. People doing extraordinary things to help each other or animals or whatever. And they talked for 15 minutes about all the short, tiny videos they've watched and seen on these various social media platforms that were about just absolutely incredible acts of wonder and generosity and service to others that touch them. I think that's where all of us are. That's who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we stay there? Well, I got to say, it's due to people with work like yours that we will have a good chance at cultivating these kind of better impulses in ourselves. So I can't thank you enough
Linda.
for being with us at the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast.
Thank you,
That's
Linda. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Well, we will talk again sometime because I've still got about 5 questions over here that we never got to. But I can't thank you enough. I hope that the insights that Ayo and I brought to this conversation will help you get through your week in some joyful way. And if you want to learn any more about these and other parts of the conspiracy of goodness, you can go to the Goodness Exchange website, and there we are talking about what's right with the world. And Ayo is certainly one of those people getting us there. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great day. Thank you, Ayo.